Very busy day on campus. I appreciate you taking time to be with us. I'm delighted to welcome Nicholas Snow today from Wabash College. Nicholas is a BKT Assistant Professor of Economics, and he also is the Tom and Ann Walsh Professor of Philosophy, Political Science and Economics at Wabash College. Nick has earned his PhD in economics from George Mason University in 2012. He's been teaching ever since at Ohio State, the Ohio State University, Kenyon College, and IU before joining Wabash on a tenure track position. Today's talk is an interesting one because it seeks to apply the ideas of Adam Smith to something that exists at Wabash College, called gentleman's rule. It's an interesting and provocative title, the Impartial Wally, Smithian analysis of Wabash College gentleman's rule. Nick will speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll take questions from both here and the online audience. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nick.
Thank you, Smithian. Wonderful to be back. And really said, I was here about 4 years ago for 2 years. I miss Bloomington, I miss IU, and I particularly miss the Ostrom workshop. It was always wonderful coming back in vibrant intellectual community. And so it's an honor to get to finally be in this position to actually come and present. As Aurelian said, this is a paper that really the motivation of it is coming from a teaching angle. So it does deviate from my usual type of work. It was inspired by my students as we are in the PPE major and developing that course. I was just finding a lot of times that students, one particular student in particular was like, I just don't get why we're reading the theory of moral sentiments. He's just talking about feelings a lot. And so that bothered me. And so it was kind of an attempt, what can I do something that would help to show them why the theory of moral sentiments is important. Stop working.
It doesn't work?
It does not. You gotta use, I think.
Might have to use that.
Getting next to it. Oh, wait.
David, we may need you a second.
No, I got it. It was on Zoom.
Yeah, it works. It works now.
Okay, so in prep, so in the PPE major, we have our intro gateway course, and we start that with the foundational thinkers section. And we have students read both the Wealth of Nations, but also from the theory of moral sentiments. And so there was a lot of confusion from the students. And so in reading it, I was thinking, well, what can we do to get them to see why this is important for the larger PPE? And in reading it, I was simultaneously reading Humanomics by Vernon Smith and Bart Wilson, and it clicked for me. I think I was literally reading the theory of moral sentiments, and I was like, wait a minute, they focus on rules in Vernon's book. And it just struck me, wait, everything that Smith is saying fits with what is going on with gentleman's rule at Wabash. And so I thought, oh, this is a perfect opportunity to benefit by doing both of getting a publication, but also having it be for Wabash College and something that can be used in the classroom to help us understand. So they read the draft that took place this semester, and it did go pretty well. But I am looking forward to your comments as I don't know who got the draft, but
I got the draft
and sent some out. If anybody didn't get it and is interested, I'm more than happy to send it. It's also been accepted at the Journal of Cosmos at Taxis. They're doing a special issue on spontaneous order and gender, which I submitted the paper to. So it's accepted and forthcoming technically, but there will be revisions. So I'm excited to see what comment. I would not have presented this here if it was done and out the door. So I'm very much looking forward to any comments you have to improve it, things like that. So it's about, as Aurelian said, potentially controversial these days, the gentleman's rule, which is the one rule that our students face. We technically have just one. If you go to the Wabash College's website, the gentleman's rule has its own web page as a part of that. And the top of it literally says 2 questions. Trust an 18-year-old? Just one rule? And the answer is yes, we have just one rule, and it perplexes everybody who's outside our community that I've showed it to, except maybe people who study spontaneous order. One comment I got in the draft was I could have done any thinker, not just Smith. I could have done like Hayek. I think that's also right. Again, because of the class is why I ended up doing Smith. All right, so the gentleman's rule though is this is it. It's very succinct, very quick, and very vague in a lot of ways, right? The student is expected to conduct himself at all times, both on and off campus, as a gentleman and a responsible citizen. Right, so I've shown that to people who are outside of Wabash, and they look at me like Leonardo DiCaprio in Inception. Wait, that's it? That's all? That's what you're talking about? There's no way that would work. It's just too vague. You get the question a lot of the times: what is a gentleman? What is a citizen? This is echoed, and there's two works on the gentleman's rule that I've been able to find. I use both of them quite extensively as a result. The first is a former Wabash student who got his PhD in education. His was invaluable as he conducted a number of ethnographic interviews that I've leveraged. He is looking at different questions than I was, but I think his interviews fit what I was doing perfectly. It saved me from having to interview students more formally. And then the second is an emeritus political scientist at Wabash. We have a humanities lecture called the LaFollette Lecture that's done every year. Pretty interesting. She said, why am I here? I'm poli-sci. But hers was on the gentleman's rule. Really what she's looking at is what is the role of a citizen in a community. And she uses Wabash as a means of this. She spent over half the speech discussing what a gentleman means and what a gentleman is. For my purposes, I'm less interested in what that means in terms of overarching. It's more what do the students think it means, and I think the Adam Smith helps to explain how we get an outcome where students have a common sense about what a gentleman is, at least on campus. It's not static either, and so this is the puzzle I'm kind of looking at why the rule works. I will state I am making no empirical claim. I will say my perception is that it does work. But as my advisor always told us, that's not the right question. Compared to what is the important question. And I'm not doing that in this. This isn't an empirical. Maybe there's better rules that exist out there. I'm just trying to show why, to what extent, if any, the gentleman's rule actually does what it's doing, why it does it. Okay, so enter Adam Smith as my method. As I said, it was very much influenced by the course that I was teaching. And really, it was just, I was rereading the book for class and was like, wait a minute, this is explaining exactly what's going on. I think this is fruitful in a couple of ways. It helps to show the students an example of why the theory of moral sentiments is important, and not just why we don't just read The Wealth of Nations, but it gives a more full picture. To me, this is a good example of like Vernon Smith's quest to eliminate the Doss-Adam Smith problem from our repertoire. If anybody doesn't know what that is, but in the 19th century, we're like, wait a minute, the Wealth of Nations and theory of moral sentiments are incompatible. Theory of moral sentiments focuses on benevolence, really it's sympathy. We'll come to that. While the other focuses on self-interest and greed. That's also kind of inaccurate in a way, but nonetheless, yes. And so they really are looking at different questions. The theory of moral sentiments is dealing more with intimate orders, while the Wealth of Nations is dealing more with the extended order and how they deal with them. And so the mechanisms, I think, are all the same. Smith is part of the Scottish Enlightenment, which is really the key contribution of that is the theory of spontaneous order. Right, what Smith's one-time friend, I guess they had a falling out, Adam Ferguson would say is it's of human action, but not of human design. Often what people refer to as the invisible hand. And so Smith's notion, his framework is one of an invisible hand theory, right? He mentions the invisible hand only 3 times in his writing, most famously in The Wealth of Nations. He says it once in the theory of moral sentiments, in which he makes the same exact point that he makes in The Wealth of Nations. And he does say it in his history of the astronomy essay that he wrote. There's the invisible hand of Jupiter. But again, all three are really just talking about spontaneous order, right, for how things go. And in my view, the theory of moral sentiments is an invisible hand theory of morality, right? Following Hume, right? How do rules emerge from the bottom up through our interaction? It's much more descriptive. Smith tries to show through our nature how we kind of develop these and why we're flawed in doing so. Right, Smith does not view this as, okay, we're perfect beings once we follow through. If you just do the invisible hand of morality, we'll be fine. No, he shows in a lot of ways we're vulnerable, which again, why I'm not making any claim that this works super well or anything. I do think it works, as we'll see. So what is the mechanism? Well, the invisible hand in the Wealth of Nations, right, is all about leveraging self-interest, right? In the extended order, we don't know each other. If we exchange, I can't rely on you to be like, don't you love me? Give me my stuff, right? Really, it doesn't know me from that he does, but it doesn't know me. I'm like, give me a Jimmy John sandwich, right? I can't really rely on his love of me to give me that. I need to rely on his love of himself, right? And so I make myself better off by making others better off. But with the theory of moral sentiments, he's talking more about, again, that intimate order where we do know each other, really, and knows me, right? He cares about me and vice versa. And so how do we get this? Well, we leverage not around self-interest in this case, although it's part of it, right? For Smith, self-interest is prudence, it is a virtue, but it's one of many virtues. And in fact, the mechanism that gets us through this is sympathy. Smith is a careful writer, and so when he says sympathy, he means it in a much broader sense than I think the modern take is, which really is just any fellow feeling with any passion whatsoever, right? Sympathy is the mechanism we feel to some degree sympathy with the feelings of others. So I could share in the sorrow, I could share in the joy of my friends, right? When Gustavo comes in and he's all super happy because he got some kind of publication, I'm likely going to be happy for him as well, right? Not necessarily to the same degree, right? He's going to feel it much more. It's happening to him. This is important because it's going to help us to moderate our behavior. It is, in other words, it is methodological individualism. Only individuals can act, but it's social. It's not an atomistic theory in which, okay, I'm just acting by myself and my own self-interest. No, we're interacting with each other and feeling the sympathy for another. Obviously, in the book, he spends a lot of time, not all feel sympathy is the same, right? You know, if somebody's really Fabio's super angry, right? We might feel some of his rage, but we're also gonna be, what's his deal? Right? And so you don't feel it to quite the same degree, but the fact that we are feeling sympathy, sharing in the sympathy with those around us helps us to lead through a process where we approach a sort of equilibrium. Not a perfect, it's not like in markets, the market's not going to clear here, but it gets it enough. Smith says, though they will never be in unison, they may be in concords. And this is all that is wanted or required, right? Why it happens, well, if I come in, I'm super happy, I did not get the response I wanted. This has been accepted at Cosmos and Taxis, you know, like, okay. All right. And to me, if I came in, it was just like, yeah, like everyone would, you guys would be like, what is wrong with him? Like, why is he so excited about this? I'm way up here. Meanwhile, I'm like, why did they not care? Well, you know, and care about me, right? I'm going to see that and go, oh, it wasn't quite there. So I'm going to bring it down next time. While you're thinking, okay, he was super excited. Maybe I should have been a little bit more caring, right? And so it brings us into kind of a unison with one another, thus regulating our behavior, forming expectations. This is something that, like Hayek would say, right? Rule of the game can help coordinate our expectations around each other and how we act and interact with one another. And I think that's kind of what's happening with moral and proper behavior. Right, we turn to the mechanism that Smith, or the metaphor that Smith utilizes, is that of an impartial spectator. Which, so really, instead, the title of my paper is The Impartial Wally. That's obviously a play on this. Wally, I should have mentioned this at the start. Wally is our mascot, so it's meant for Wabash students. Right, but the impartial spectator is basically we kind of imagine ourselves and we think, okay, what would a third-party observer who is unbiased, impartial to us, what would they think about our behavior? right? And we learn that through the interaction of others, right? Tarzan, for example, right, grew up in the jungle, thrown into society is not going to know how to act morally or properly because they don't have the social interaction to understand or discover the virtues about how to behave appropriately in the correct way with each other, right? But this third party mechanism kind of allows us to step outside of ourselves, acts as a moral yardstick. I've heard people call it your conscience. But it's stemming from the empathy that we often feel for one another. Smith never uses the term empathy because it didn't exist yet. However, if you see read Sam Fleischecker's fantastic book, I think it's called You and Me, he goes over the modern view of empathy and how that's related in Smith. But this is all just a bottom-up order, the mechanism that allows us to come back and say, okay, is my behavior appropriate? What Smith would call propriety, right? And so the propriety response can be found in the suitableness or unsuitableness, in the proportion or disproportion which effects seem to bear in the cause or object with it cites it, right? So the response of others gets us there. Sorry, I couldn't resist. The bear is, you're going to use the wrong fork. You can't see it behind the thing, but the woman is aghast because he's using the wrong one, or at least the bear thinks that, right? So this helps to regulate our actions, but it's a necessarily social thing, right? Again, Tarzan would have no idea how to behave appropriately until he's put into society and learns through that interaction, right? But we get mechanisms, feedback mechanisms in our interactions with one another that gets us there. And so where does this leave us with the gentleman's rule? I think the gentleman's rule leverages this by creating a focal point. In economics, this is often referred to as a Schelling point. Schelling asks, okay, if we're going to meet in New York tomorrow, right? But that's where he leaves it, right? This is an absurd notion, right? To meet in New York is huge. Millions of people, didn't specify what time of day. But what Schelling kind of argues is, look, we actually will find each other a surprising amount of times, right? Because we can congregate around this focal point, right? We come together, well, let's meet at noon. Well, that's a logical time, Grand Central Station. Yeah, it's not a guarantee, but surprisingly, like, we should never find each other, but that's not true, right? In grad school, the joke we always had was that a focal point is Chipotle. So you're going for lunch, well, let's go to Chipotle. And so I think the gentleman's rule is kind of acting as a focal point under which, okay, what is the appropriate behavior? It's giving the students something to call back to, which in my experience is all over the place. I was at Wabash for less than a month before I realized the power of this thing. I had a student, let's call him Joe. He was constantly coming late to class. That's not something that happens at Wabash frequently. I didn't really care. He wasn't being disruptive when he came in or anything. But the other students did care. And so I did not say anything. And one of the students came up to me and said, "Don't worry, Professor, we got this. Joe won't be late again." And I'm like, "What are you going to do?" And he's like, "We're just going to remind him of the gentleman's rule." And Joe was never late again. That's just one example of countless constant checking on one another from the gentleman, right? When you're not behaving gentlemanly, right, gets this. So what is the gentleman's rule again, beyond that simple thing? The rule has existed for a very long time. It only became formalized in the 1950s. So the guy on the right is Byron K. Trippett. Remember from Earline's intro, I'm the BKT assistant professor. Every assistant professor is the BKT. This is Byron K. Trippett. He's our former president and dean. He initiated it. He credits George Kendall, who was dean of the students at the time in the 1950s, as the architect. But they were very excited about it. But really all they were doing was leveraging an existing informal rule that had existed. I found a memo in our archives that dates at the latest the emergence of a similar rule like this to the 1840s. We were founded in 1832, so pretty quick into this. You do have deviations. There's attempts to, as Byron K. Trippett says, that what's great about it is we treat students like adults. And so we avoid these petty prohibitions and specific things. Well, early in the cause, there's attempts at providing petty prohibitions and things, but never really stuck. And so they kind of formalized this, and as this quote kind of shows, they viewed it as successful, at least within the first 20 years. It's still there. The students love it, and I think part of why they love it is it provides them with freedom, and they recognize that with that freedom also comes with the responsibility. So as Hayek says, these are two sides of the same coin. When you talk to the students about it, they get very worried. They were very worried through the pandemic with this because there were calls for more stringent, clear, defined rules that would emerge. It kind of just made them step up even more. When you talk to them, it's kind of like walking on thin ice or eggshells around this. They love it and don't want to lose it. Right. And so when students misbehave and are doing things that they shouldn't, you immediately get responses to this. And I think the students echo this. I won't read the quotes for the sake of time. I'd rather hear your thoughts. But the gentleman's rule, basically, they talk about the love of freedom, but the connection to the responsibility that comes with this. In particular, they view it as their role to help check each other, right? They keep each other honest with it. And that's where the enforcement primarily comes from, right? They are enforced by the students themselves. It is, of course, it's a formal rule. So there is a backstop for more serious things or things that the students can't settle themselves. They do turn to the dean of students who invoke this. They're constantly kind of like, should we get rid of this? Which again, makes the students try to enforce it themselves even more. And so it's primarily done through students. And as I said, I saw it right away. And you go to class, you do the appropriate things, you treat people with respect. They're really upset when you don't do it. And I have tons of quotes. Like, again, I'm kind of cherry picking some of the quotes, but there's a lot more that are in my paper, but also ones that I just did not have space for. So there's this one student says, it's frowned upon to be ungentlemanly, not to be gentlemanly. And it's made known. People will tell you you're doing something wrong. I have seen this firsthand. They get really mad with students who aren't following the rules. And it's a big consequence of this, right? Part of what I'll get to is why it doesn't work in larger environments is just simply because there's just too many, right? If you mess up in your one friend group here at IU, you'll find another one. At Wabash, we're so small, you mess up in your friend group, you're probably going to have a hard time finding more friends because everyone's going to know about this kind of misbehavior. And so they really are stringent and example about this. One of the examples I use in the paper to try to get at this is the example of drinking to excess. This is an issue at Wabash. I'm not claiming it doesn't happen by any stretch. In fact, it's probably a problem. However, I do think based on the interviews that collected is that there is real evidence that the rule does something to dampen it a little. So again, I'm not making any empirical claim that this is superior to anything. Maybe there's better solutions, but you get a lot of sense that there is drinking that happens on campus. Students like it, but they really hold each other accountable to make sure that they don't go too far. Lots of quotes here. All right. Where's the one I like? What's this one? Yeah. Wabash always fights is one of our always sayings. All right. And so that guy's they only have one rule. We can go there and we can party. We can drink the whole time. It'll be fun. Well, yeah, but as soon as the students get on campus, they understand that we carry ourselves in a different manner. And you see a check on this. Again, there's a lot of over drinking. I'm not claiming that they're not doing this, nor that it's not a problem, but you can at least see some evidence, anecdotally at least, where students are holding each other accountable. I've heard stories of students who do go too far and other students will be like, you're done, you're not having any more drinks, go home, right? And they invoke the gentleman's rule. So it's something that really does kind of kick in. As I said, this isn't a panacea. It's happening in what Smith calls the spheres of sympathy. It only is going to work in the more intimate order, not the extended order. We can't rely on sympathy because it's going to be too muted. Right. In the famous example in the theory of moral sentiments, he says, okay, imagine an earthquake that kills 1 million people in China, we're all going to be very sad about that. However, we're all probably going to lose more sleep at night if we believe we're going to lose our little pinky. All right, we're going to be more upset about that. All right, now there's a mechanism here going on. Smith said that I once did this in class and I feel bad because I was like, oh, imagine like there's a button and you can push that button and it causes 1 million people in China to die, but you save your pinky. And I was like, none of us would push it. And the one student was like, I would push it. And then I'm like, oh, well, Smith calls those people monsters. So we wouldn't physically do it, but again, we're so detached from the people in China that we're not going to feel very sympathetic toward them. That sympathetic link is not going to be very strong, right? And so in larger communities, something like the gentleman's rule, once again, I don't think it has to be gentleman's rule. Any proper behavior rule like this isn't going to work here simply because it's too big. There's too many strangers. Strangers would complicate the matter, right? I can get away with more improper behavior in larger environments, and maybe a different set of rule structures is needed. So again, this paper is not making any claims about policy prescriptions. I'm not arguing this should be adopted by anybody. It's more of a positive analysis of what I think is happening at Wabash, which again is going to be a very small homogeneous community. In fact, it is a homogeneous community in a very obvious way. It is all male. Right, we're one of 2 all-male colleges in the country. Us at Hampton, Sydney. Technically, Morehouse is also considered all-male, but they share a sister college that they attend classes with. So we usually don't like to count them. Right, and so as a result of that all-male nature, which I'm going to skip that one and come back. I do need more of this in the paper, I think. The little I do have in this, I do think it does help to put a pretty good spin on what masculinity means to the students, right? It helps define it. It also is a good example of showing why it's not a static thing. What gentlemanliness meant probably in this picture in the 1920s is going to be very different from the modern students on the right. In this case, right? And so it's an evolving thing. But it does, by focusing on proper behavior, you do have some evidence that shows that it's altering how the men of Wabash are seeing the role of masculinity in society, at least to some extent. One of the other last things I'll mention is one of my favorite quotes from Theoretical Sentiments is about the man of the system, right? Which I was a little disappointed to hear. Apparently, Smith stole this from Bernard Mandeville. And I say, but it's still cool, right? Yeah. So he says the man of the system, right, is going to be so apt in his own ability to kind of control and force things from up on high. Right? We're going to impose from the top down. Do this by doing so. We're kind of treating people like they're chess pieces on a board. That's my picture. All right. But in reality, like these chess pieces are not chess pieces. They're people who have their own wants and desires. And this can frustrate it. I think what's good about the gentleman's rule is it acts as what Smith says is a loose, vague, and indeterminate rule whose meaning comes through the interaction of the students, right? And so it is a very liberal rule in the classical liberal type sense. We're allowing freedom of interaction and seeing how order kind of emerges out of this process that we have. Okay, so in kind of conclusion, right, I think the gentleman's rule is acting as a mechanism that kind of brings the impartial spectator out to the students, reminding them of what everybody else thinks and helping them to define what a gentleman is, and therefore, more importantly, less gentleman, but more what is proper and appropriate behavior that provides real consequences. I hope I wasn't too short there. Yeah.
Good, thank you. So we can take questions from the room, and then if there's anyone who would want online, we'll do it. So we'll start with Les.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I used to teach before I retired, I taught a course on civil society that included a unit on humanitarian aid of the public policy school. And I did use the section from Smith on the earthquake earthquake in China. And I'd encourage you, we don't have to get into the debate now, but I think he actually went beyond that in that excerpt. Where
I'm
he,
getting my notes so I can.
okay, where he, and then I'm going to raise a larger issue, where he, raises the question you quoted, how could, without knowing them, why wouldn't anyone sacrifice me? Then he goes on to add, start talking about the role of the impartial spectator and says, well, we don't behave that way. Why don't we? And it's because he argues, I'm not obviously not quoting it directly, that to ignore hardship, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, historically, he was although he uses China, he was writing in the context of the great earthquake in Lisbon.
Yeah.
I
think that's right.
And he says, why don't we? Why do we provide aid? And he talks again about the impartial spectator and our sense of what it means to be lovely, I believe is the word he uses. And he says, if we knew what was going on and we didn't provide help, we wouldn't think as well of ourselves, in fact. So I think he has a sense that this concept of sympathy can apply to an extent of good. Now, the larger point I wanted to make, so the main reading I used, one of the main readings I used in this was a chapter from James Q. Wilson's book, The Moral Sense, in which he discusses the whole chapter on the concept of sympathy. And a key point he makes, it is a powerful idea, as you've illustrated here, but it could also be powerful for bad as well as for good. And the example one of the examples he uses were the Nazi death troops. Why would a German who lived a moral life as a civilian suddenly wind up in, I believe they were called Einsatzgruppen, and participate in shooting people into a trench? And his argument is the same sense of sympathy that might otherwise lead them to do good things also encourages them under certain circumstances to behave in not so good ways. And as a former soldier myself back in the Vietnam War, military understands this. You really want to, some other examples of gentleman rule type things are in the military academies. You want to encourage, build up unit sympathy, because people are going to be faced with extreme situations where they will have to work together. So I guess the question I would ask is, the Wally rule isn't specific as to what it means to be a gentleman. Suppose, let's take a weird example, a Hugh Hefner acolyte became president of Wabash someday. Would the gentleman's rule change in ways that might encourage behavior that, say, would be supported by the famous Playboy philosophy?
I think the answer is yes. I think I do a little bit better job at the paper of kind of saying this isn't automatically a good thing. I should, though, you make me think I should cite, I know Virgil Storr has a great article on versus spontaneous orders. And so there is a real danger. What it comes about is, you're right, I don't think you need the president to be the one to do this, right? There's a bunch of really cool kids that come in, students that come in, and they're like, this is how we're gonna behave now. They're forceful, right? I can imagine that coming. I mean, I would bet, like the picture I showed, right? I wouldn't be surprised if, like these guys jumped in a time machine and met those guys, and these guys would be appalled at the behavior, right? And so it is happening already. What I think one of the benefits of this is that it is flexible, but that flexibility does provide the danger of not all spontaneous orders are good. And so again, one of the reasons why I wanted to avoid any normative claim here that this is positive in the case. Outside the paper, I'll say, I do think it is working well. But part of why I think they need to constantly be vigilant about this, right? It's not something you could get lax on because it easily could slip into that. One of the cool things I think is the students are very aware of that, right? So that's why the walking an eggshell or thin ice element of it, they're in constant fear that this rule will be taken away from them. And they don't want to lose that freedom. But yeah, it's a good point because it's not a guarantee or a given that it's going to maintain that way.
Gustavo?
So, well, fascinating. The presentation was awesome. So it's I was thinking about different instances in which this type of rules could work better or worse. So one possible scenario that you can have in mind is a situation in which so what do we mean by proper behavior? It's like improper behavior would be something like I do something that benefit me but hurt you. So the rule is trying to avoid that, okay? That's much more complicated to stop. But what about if you're talking about the so it's a commitment problem. So it's like, I can be self-temptation problem, essentially. It's like, I can be tempted to overdrink, and you can be tempted to overdrink. So we make an agreement, essentially an implicit one, that you will be my commitment device when I am tempted, and I'm going to be your commitment device when you are tempted. That's much easier to enforce. So I will wonder if sometimes, essentially, the nature of what type of good equilibrium that we are trying to support makes these rules more or less successful. And I think those are very, because essentially, if you try to use these rules for things in which I have a lot of benefits from one action, and then this could produce some harm on you, that's much more complicated to enforce. The temptations are really high there. But if you're talking about more like a commitment device, that's a better scenario in which it could work. No?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what it's acting as, but kind of similar. It's not a guarantee it's going to stay that way, right? So it acts as a mechanism. One of the things that I kind of didn't say that I probably should have is the students, in loving it, are very protective of it. And one of the things they do is they make sure new students know about this right away. And I've noticed this. I think freshmen are not as well behaved. Something happens to Wabash students. They're kind of on the weaker end as freshmen, and then they get really great as seniors. But I've noticed in my we have a class that we teach freshman tutorial. It's kind of weird. You're stepping out. It's not an econ class that I would teach. And so, but it's really how to do college course. And the students are very weak at that sort of stuff. But they start talking about the gentleman's rule pretty quick. Well, where are they getting it? Well, they're told about it in the prospective student meetings when they come to the campus. They have a lot of time they spend on it at freshman orientation. But I think the biggest area they get it is at their fraternities and in their sports club, right? That's on the sports team. And so I think they're reinforcing this. They're like, we're checking each other. It's rather than A and B are agreeing to watch each other. We're all agreeing to watch each other. Again, I think that's an unstable equilibrium if you're not careful, right? You have to know what this is doing. If you get lax on that, the mechanism will go away pretty quickly. I don't know that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think it's yep, I think I was thinking about so how far you can go with this type of rules in terms of enforcing.
Yeah, and I don't think you can go too far. Like again, it's don't be a man of the system, right? This isn't my point is don't be like, okay,
yeah, exactly.
I mean, this is so great, let's apply it here, right? It ain't gonna work, right? So I presented this a while ago when I was at Wabash in our Division III colloquium. One of the comments was, well, like, could this be used to stop this right after the riots, the Capitol riot? I was like, can that be used? I don't think it would. And I'm like, no, for the very reason of the slide about IU. It's like, it's not gonna work. Protecting the Capitol. So this isn't like a tool you can just apply and be like, here's your rule. It needs to be something that emerges through an already thing. Again, I think if you know, on the question, if Byron K. Trippett and George Kendall were like, all right, we're implementing this and there was no historical connection, it would have fallen flat. Right. This was a rule that kind of already existed informally. And so all they were doing was formalizing something that was already there and had roots from the bottom up. Right. So I don't know how it's again, this isn't a how-to kind of story. It's more of a right, it exists. Why is it working?
So we'll talk two comments. Comment number one is if you're going to write about this more, what does this tell us about other gentlemen's orders? So for example, I was thinking it was ungentlemanly.
Repeat what you said, which order?
So I was about to say, for example, Caltech.
Yeah.
It's famous for just like the calculus teacher just gives you a test, take a few hours to work on it, and there's an assumption that there's no cheating.
Yeah.
And so I think the thing that's kind of in the shadows, which maybe you could bring out on maybe an extra paper or something, is how generalizable is this? And this is not about an argument about using this top down, but just like in general throughout society where these orders exist. The military is a fascinating case because they use it, but it is a large scale order, which Smithianism would suggest would not be terribly good for, right? Because even if you can't choose your barracks, you're going to be rotated out in a year or something. Also to think about the limits. So for example, one of your slides actually shows the chessboard. And that's interesting because that's from a TV show called The Queen's Gambit. And very competitive chess is a great example of a situation or society that uses a gentleman's order, but it's so imperfect. Right, just like it's supposed to be this gentlemanly thing, and everybody knows there's rampant alcohol abuse, cheating. There's stories of, players throwing chess pieces at each other. And I mean, there was a very big cheating scandal that broke a few months ago in the world of competitive chess. So maybe one research question for you to think about, then I have a gender comment, is what's the bigger class of organizations that can plausibly set up this kind of order and have it work on some level? Is it just like a liberal arts ethos and like that's it? Or are there other forms of society where that would work? I don't know. And then the other thing that is really kind of, gets my grub here is how much of this is dependent on the fact that it's monogendered, like single gendered. So for example, if I were Seamus Khan out of Princeton, he has a whole book called Sexual Citizens, talking about like the new rules for sexual behavior on campuses that have arisen. It is a complete refutation of the gentleman's order. It's like, and maybe the passion for sexual contact is so large that it would just steamroll over these things. And you can have a gentleman's order, you don't have sexual attraction to most of the population there. Right? And so how much of the gentleman's order is dependent on uniform culture, shared values, or eliminating some sort of interest, like, all guys colleges eliminate like the sexual interest right there. Or you can imagine some other elimination of an interest. So how much does the lopsided gender story here matter?
So we for the special issue, we had a workshop with all the authors. And that was the common claim that they made. They were like, this would not work at an integrated school. I don't know. I think it's at a small school of this, it's possible that it's right and it would not work. I'm more optimistic. I think that it would. It might look a little different. You're certainly not going to call it a gentleman's rule in that case, right? The golden rule. Yes, I think that's really kind of more what it is. Almost a shame it's called the gentleman's rule in a way. But like I think it's possible that a small enough group, if they're homogeneous on some other margin, that it could. But I do think there is something to that identification that people are having that is helping them rally around this. We're always very skeptical. We ask the students, well, why do you like the all male element of this? And most professors are like, your answer is there's no way this is right. They're just like, oh, well, I'm less uncomfortable because I don't have to worry that there's no women in the room. I don't buy that, but like they at least have some kind of perception that that's what's going on. So I think, yeah, this is worth looking at. And one of the things I think is the whole, I need to think a little bit better about the role of gender, especially since it's gonna go in that special issue on gender.
Like another society that just popped into mind is the world of international diplomacy. Like they're notorious for gentlemen's rules, like, yeah, well, we won't invade this country if you don't invade this, we'll turn over this spy, we'll stop harassing this diplomat. And it's probably because they live in this, international but super dense network.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's less so now.
Maybe less so now, but previous eras, there was this kind of like, and they would say the word.
That could be a cool, right, show, okay, something similar is happening, but then why it was fragile in one way.
Right, and then it became more globalized, right, more countries, more nation states.
Think of themselves as part of a club.
Yeah.
Really did. I've worked in that world.
And I think that's a big part of why there is a pride of being a Wabash student. You see this, it's really funny, whenever I wear something Wabash at an airport, I'll be like in Denver. And someone inevitably will be like, oh, I know I go to Wabash. And then they get really disappointed because they're like, you're a student? And I'm like, no, I'm a professor. And they're like, oh, that's cool. So they really do, like, my point being is they really have a connection to, the alumni have a connection to the current students and all that stuff.
Can I just build on what Fabio just said, with a couple of other examples? One organization has been reasonably well studied that operates along these lines is Alcoholics Anonymous. And then there's some other 12, I think they're called 12-step programs as well. I haven't looked at more recent research, but about a decade ago, they were thought to be fairly effective in what they did. In fact, so much so that they were a staple of prison rehabilitation efforts. The other example, again, to the larger side, but also suggesting the importance of characteristics. There was a village in the south of France that sheltered Jewish refugees, and that was the route, as you may remember, into the Pyrenees, and escaped, sheltered them throughout the Second World War. A great book on this is called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. I could send you the full site. But even though the Nazis were suspicious, Vichy and so on, village didn't crack and sheltered, Jewish refugees throughout the war. Well, it turns out this was a Huguenot village. So,
Interesting.
yeah, so it was obviously a minority village. In fact, the primary driver of all this was the local minister, and who was eventually, I think, sent to a concentration camp. But so again, question of the extent also of this depends partly on priors, such as in this case, religion. There are other possibilities as well.
That's a good point that I could talk about how there were existing priors. Once it became more formalized, but easy for it to stick.
I don't know a lot about the Wabash student body, but my sense is it, apart from being all male, it's homogenous in other ways as well.
I think so too.
Even if the body of students come from different.
Yeah, I mean, where there, most students
Not that
are
elite.
usually lower income Indianians. We are broadening Hoosiers, sorry, new. Guess I've been here long enough, I should know better.
Cancel culture.
Yeah, so there are, elements that they're that, but we are broadening. We're getting a lot more from Texas. There's international students. We do have some diversity, but they're politically, they tend to be very much more conservative. We're interested in more conservative students tend to be very progressive faculty. But yeah, the students themselves are fairly close. So yeah, I think there's a lot of more interesting.
Nick?
Yeah, just another place to look, and Professor Craiutu will like this, in Persian letters, the Montesquieu book, The Story of the Troglodytes. And it similar to your Tarzan example, and it's an emergent moral order. and they have rules, but then they're met with outsiders, and the rules kind of break down.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. And just another point on that sort of breakdown, you know, the scalability issue is something I think you cover really well. And that's also something my student thinks about a lot. A lot of the American founders thought about, but we do have some large agreements that do endure, you know, constitutionalism and all sorts of other national things. But now we see running into all kinds of problems there. So kind of understanding why sometimes you can get these things to work on a large scale, and sometimes, you know, small is better.
Yeah, I mean, my co-author Pete Leeson does a lot of work on like showing where it's fun. These things work a lot better than we even think, even in cases where economists say it shouldn't, right? Like large heterogeneous groups, right? We can find examples for certain. So.
Gustavo?
So
Sorry.
you want to go first?
Well, I have to leave in about 3 or 4
Go.
Go.
Yeah, you should go.
Do you think something like Smithian sympathy is applicable in a classical city-state culture like ancient Sparta, or like a sort of small homogeneous society where you had great liberty, but they adhered very much to this very strict moral code, perhaps for fear of being ostracized by their fellow Spartans?
Yeah, and I think that was kind of my point, where it's like, okay, like the friend group thing that I said, like, you know, you mess up, okay, well, so many students would find somebody else. Well, here, yeah, it's almost like you're gonna be ostracized if you're really. They're more forgiving. It's not like you mess up, you're done, but like you do something serious, it really is a real check because it has real social consequences for them. So yeah, actually, I like that analogy.
Thanks, Scott. Gustavo?
So imagine the following thought experiment, no? Every college on the US has the same rule. It's effective and it's working. I think they all fall down. So essentially, it's like the key point here is like, to what extent it's we are different from the rest is what is sustaining the rule. So it's like we do not behave like the rest of the mortals. So it's essentially
Because
it provides a little bit of pride or something like that you are different. No?
yeah, I think that's absolutely true in a lot of ways, how Wabash students.
And that put the limit on scaling up these things. So essentially, in some sense, it only works. So you may even have like kind of unraveling effect. It only works at the top in some sense, because the next one, you always need a reference point to sustain them.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's I went to a high school, secondary school with an implicit similar rule, but more for effort and study. And then, but I think the key thing sustaining the rule was that people considered that it was the best school on town. So essentially, so it's like if you remove that would fall immediately. So it's so you get this. So suddenly you have like many variables highly aligned. No, it's like you have selection. You have this thing that because they are different from outsiders, you can build a rule, and then the key question there is like, what's the rule is doing? So it's on top of that. So you may even not have the rule, and then
that's
selection, and then it's pride effect. You get
this would exist already, even without the formal rule, or even an informal one.
Yeah.
It's kind of it. But what it does is it amplifies. I guess that's my focal point. It's creating that focal point to join around. But I think you're right. I think there's also we're different than other places. They leverage that. We're not like you want to be like everyone else. Go somewhere else.
And I think
you hear that kind of a lot.
And you can use, I think, maybe similar ideas for armies. It's like you may start with a very strong rule or, in your small group. But then if they start falling, or there's something like overall, we are losing in the battle, then everything it's levels, no? It's kind of a domino effect.
Yeah.
Or maybe the other way around, just like with this testing, so it generates, people are, show strength. No, it's like you can be the only platoon that is holding in this queer staff situation, no?
Yeah, it's kind of like
More
okay,
trenchant.
when does central planning work? Well, like war, right? We have one goal, right? It's easy to
Yes,
get that
one-
when you have the one goal. So we're rallying around this one element. Makes it easier to coordinate behavior and expectations. Yeah.
I want to bring back the issue of gender briefly for a moment here. So I'm thinking about the secret societies at Yale, for example, the one with the skull and whatever, bones.
Skull and bones.
Skull and bones. Can those societies become more inclusive, gender and race and economic backgrounds, and still maintain the same level of cohesiveness, secrecy, as well as, I don't know, solidarity? It doesn't have to be gentleman rule, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
But there is something about these organizations, as you suggested, Gustavo, that can be expanded so that it's not about the gentleman's rule, it's about something else that builds upon that. But
What do we find in common?
yes, yeah. So I think that's an interesting opening of your research. And to what extent our democratic societies need those, and what kind of organizations of that sort can strengthen the democratic ethos, and what kind of those organizations can jeopardize it? I think that,
Isn't that, I mean, as a Tocqueville expert, right? Isn't that kind of Tocqueville's like main point? We need the civil society because it's providing smaller,
yeah,
societies for us, right? Which
Platoons.
we are entering in the more intimate order, put in those terms rather than our ever more approaching the extended order, right? It's important that we have the intimate orders that maintain in the larger democracy, right?
it's just that the spirit of equality sometimes might go against those, because it seeks to level and makes us part of, I don't know, atoms in a larger structure.
Yeah, I'd mentioned James Q. Wilson before, and I should disclose that he was on my PhD committee years ago. But
I've heard of him, so I'm definitely gonna look at this.
Yes,
Chat, no, I don't know if you.
but you'll have to take the question in the chat.
Yeah, so mine's very quickly, so do you want me to finish? Or-
Yeah.
So Wilson, that's known as a student of bureaucracy, government, et cetera. So why is he writing a book about the moral sense? Well, he had come to the conclusion that the success of public policy ultimately depends on the behavior, the moral behavior of citizens. This is, and spent a lot of his time looking for how you can design public policies that bring out the equivalent of the gentleman's rule. He's best known in this regard for his broken windows ideas about crime control, the idea that if you create a sense of neighborhood order,
That was why his name sounded so familiar.
the crime would line, but we're still wrestling with this. I mean, the tendency now is exemplified by the governor of Florida's efforts is not really to think that maybe you can legislate this, with various rules, which probably I'm almost certain is not the way to go. But you might give some thought to efforts in public policy that did try to affect a moral behavior. One example that I'd been involved with was the 1996 welfare reform, which sought, by changing around the public assistance system, to incentivize in effect. And there's a big debate. I don't know, Fabio, if you've looked at this, but there's a sense that maybe out of wedlock pregnancies have declined as a result of changes in the law. So you might, think, because again, it gets to this question of small community versus extended. Can a government, whether a national government, a state government, a city government, Chicago, for example, can they rearrange public policies in a way that would encourage more, let's call it gentlemanly behavior?
Yeah, and you stop at dinner and you said, okay, sometimes we think more strict understood rules is like often the better thing to do. But I think what this is kind of showing is it's, again, I don't know, not the policy expert on when to do this, but like the question is, when do we want more strict, clearly defined rules versus when do we want the loose, vague, and indeterminate type things? And it's not always clear and where that line is. So yeah, I think that kind of route would be good. There was somebody in the chat.
Yeah, I think probably if you see, you'll probably see it. Or is you, Jamie?
Yeah, here, I'll take off my PowerPoint. There we go.
Use.
I'm on mute, okay.
Yes, hi everyone.
It's
It's good to see all of you. I wish I were in Bloomington today, but next week, hopefully I'll see some of you next week. No, Nick, it was really fun to hear some of your, to hear a bit of your presentation in your paper. And so throughout the conversation, I've taken a few notes about some things that I wanted to respond to. One was like the idea of, I actually thought of an example of another group that's, homogeneous and it's only males, kind of like a sports team, like Wabash College. And it comes from my world. It's like the various types of boy choirs, because they grow up, with the same sense of responsibility and taking ownership, even though they're working on a team towards this common goal of producing music. Like each person is also incredibly responsible. I've actually never thought to look into the codes governing boy choirs, so I don't know if there are any books or literature. If that's like a rabbit trail you want to go down, let me know.
Yeah, sounds cool.
Yeah, but okay, I want to push back on your comment about Storr's article on perverse spontaneous orders, because we've talked about that through the Adam Smith sequence that the Mercator Center holds. Yep. And Bobby Hertzberg made the interesting observation that, well, these aren't necessarily orders, these are more like events, because they were so contained within a small window of time, right? And of course, the idea of perverse spontaneous orders that Virgil Storr is examining is one example of riots, and how the rioters decided that they wouldn't attack certain stores. So some stores were protected by the rioters themselves. And so that's what they're calling perverse spontaneous order. But the perversity is the riot, right? But that's an event rather than an order. So that's something I don't know. I thought Bobby was very convincing. I've changed my so that's something to consider, I suppose. And I think my third point was like the example of professor of the Wabash College, like being the small community, because when you're describing the student code, it reminds me of kind of my own experience as an undergrad. But I went to a co-ed school, University of Tulsa, and even though we didn't have like a code we didn't have to sign any codes. And yet, like my friends and I, we all knew like you're not supposed to cheat. We took that very seriously. You don't plagiarize. And our professors treated us like adults. Like even though we're 18, 19, 20, through 22, they gave us the sense that we could be responsible. And so we actually rose to the occasion. And so that makes me wonder, do professors at Wabash College, I know you said that you didn't have to enforce the code, but because of that culture, do you then find that you can treat your students like adults, even though they are in their late teens and early 20s?
Yeah, so I'll start with that one and then go back to the bad spontaneous orders. Yes, I think the faculty love, and so I will say the students primarily are the ones enforcing it. However, faculty often do it. I find myself doing it all the time. With mundane things too. I'll be like, oh, there's like this important speaker coming. You should go. It's a gentlemanly thing to do. And so we do find ourselves referred to it as well. It is really community-wide that is enforced. They really care about it amongst themselves the most. And so you do see that it is very strong and powerful. I do like that Bobby's idea of it's an event versus an order. And I think there's a sense in which that's true. And it also in the sense that Smith kind of explains that, right? You're going to be looked down upon after doing that, right? I mean, the riot happens, like people are like, oh, that's not a good thing to do. People criticize those things when that happens. I will say that I do think bad spontaneous orders are still possible. One example that I can think of is Pete Leeson's paper on, what does he call it? It's the laws of lawlessness is what he calls the paper. It's about the borderland between England and Scotland at the time, and they hated each other's guts, but there wasn't strong governance from either of their states. They couldn't turn to either, like if you had a dispute with a Scottish person, you can't turn to their government and be like, help me with your citizen who did these wrong things. And so what emerged out of it is essentially a culture of grieving. They're like, okay, well, there's all these rules about when I can go and I can read Fabio and take his things, and when he can do it to me. No one's sitting there going, that's a good outcome. But it did persist. I do think bad spontaneous orders, for a lot of the reasons that Smith is highlighting and later Hayek did, they're going to be good. But I think there's always a danger of real bad spontaneous orders still emerging. But yeah, I definitely need to avoid that event point, because that's a good one. That doesn't mean it's a bad spontaneous order.
It's a very nice talk. I'm gonna leave in a minute, but I wanted to drop an empirical example. The Telluride Association. That is where they really devolve a lot of self-control to the students. If you never heard of it, it's the Telluride Association.
It's in Colorado.
Yeah, so is founded by a philanthropist who got his money from mining and that sort of thing. And he decided he wanted to create an educational organization that has its own college. It's called Deep Springs College. And so it is high level of gentlemanly order. And the students are supposed to run the college on their own terms. They also have summer programs. I actually taught one of those. My wife is an alumni of the Telluride program. And so that's an interesting case study where we've actually gone through evolutions. Like, should we let women in? Yes or no? And then you can see how the rule evolves. And then there was recently like a Substack or Medium essay about a faculty member who was upset that kind of, there was a student mobilization, to use the polite term, and they kind of voted the instructor out. Like
at Deep Springs?
At one of their summer programs. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and so this is just like, and so when you teach in these things, and I can tell you as a former teacher that like, there's a lot of self-governance. We let people do that. And then sometimes it doesn't go the way you imagined. So anyway, I just want to put that on the table.
Yeah, no, that's a good one.
Say very nice talk, and that's something you can think about.
Frank Fukuyama, who'll be here next week,
I'm hearing, yeah.
is a Deep Springs
She's a alumni.
Really?
alum. Yeah.
Really? But they also work there, right? They farm, they
Oh, yeah, so Deep Springs is like, they're supposed to farm, maintain,
maintain
they
the.
choose the faculty, they self-govern, they do so much, yeah.
So that's called self-governance taken to extremes.
Yes.
For some it's extremes, for some it's good.
Yes, that's right.
Thanks Fabio for coming. Any other points, comments? What I find interesting here is the concept of self-governance, which is central.
The main
Which,
thing
yeah,
I'm
which is
interested
central.
in, yeah.
And also the concept of civility. So when you bring the two together, self-governance and civility, I think it shows that they can provide, I think, the foundations for, I would say, a decent society. It doesn't have to be liberal or conservative.
No, yeah.
It's a fundamental sense of decency that emerges from this interaction. You don't want to hurt others. You want to sympathy. You want to help. You want to be responsible. You want to be respected in turn. So I think this is good. Some may be taken aback by the conservative connotations of the term gentleman rule, but I think that the conversation shows that it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, to me, that's
The other-
I've tried to actually mostly avoid that for that very reason. I don't think that's the real linchpin.
No, it's just one of the incarnations of this very interesting, but you can find other organizations from the Freemasons to, I don't know,
Yeah.
self-aid societies.
The other area I did some writing about had to do with the response to COVID in this context. So there is actually an archive on the 1918 flu epidemic, which is at the University of Michigan. And early on in the pandemic, the director of it or somebody, a historian, was quoted as saying the difference between the response to 1918 and now is in 1918, they had a greater sense of civic responsibility. And I asked him what he meant by that. And he said, well, we're coming at the end of World War One. Well, World War One was, like meant most wars, divisive. It wasn't that. But it also turns out that about the first 20 years of the 20th century were the heyday of association forming, boys clubs, girls club, etc. In fact, the phrase social capital was invented at that time during the First World War. And so the question was, which I wrote about, Elizabeth Clemens had a book on this called Civic Gifts, which looked at the role of voluntary groups in responding to disasters. But since the end of the Second World War, at least, we've seen more of the response led by one or another type of public policy rather than voluntary groups. And of course, we know that at least since the 90s, memberships have been declining and so on. So there were any number of public health officers, including one here in Monroe County, who went on record pleading with the public to exercise greater civic responsibility. I think the governor of Alabama did this. It was all sorts of, and you know, as you look back at, we're just beginning to look back on the COVID experience, you wonder what might have been different if instead of being led by public authorities, even better ones than the ones we had, there might have been a different set of outcomes if there was more done in the community or state level using civil society.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And actually, it's the COVID thing is actually a better answer to Jamie's original thing about how faculty get involved. We were very unique, right? We went online in 2020 in the spring and didn't come back that semester. But unlike a lot of our peers, we were back in the fall. And they were very, as I said, they're mainly conservative students. So when you got back, there was all this grumbling about the protocols, and it's the other extreme of, okay, pretend this isn't a thing, even though it is, right? And what our president was a chemist, all right, and so he was very steeped in the science, and he liked to point to that, but that didn't do much. It was more the pleas to the gentleman's rule. There were two mechanisms we used. Pleads to the gentleman's rule, right? The gentleman's gonna wear his mask. The gentleman's not feeling well, he's not coming in today, right? A gentleman communicates with the professors, right? And I do think it worked very well. We were able to come back and do this. It is muffled a little. The other thing we used was, you know who doesn't follow COVID protocols? Is DePaul students. That's our rivals. Yeah. And so I don't want to give too much credit to the gentleman's rule, but I do think we helped to leverage that in ways that I think a lot of our peers just did not, and it helped us to come back a little bit sooner. Again, you can't fully say it's because of this. This is the small community helped, but again, that's what's helping with this.
It is though. I mean, we're beginning to get the after action reports. They mostly center on what did the CDC do, what did Dr. Fauci do, et cetera, but really looking more at what various communities did or didn't do and why.
Yeah, and just in how we interact with one another about this, right? Okay, I come in, everyone's wearing masks, and I'm like, I refuse. It's gonna be pretty social response is gonna come back.
Sweden is usually cited as, I mean, again, there's debate, as an example of a country that managed through COVID better than many others. Well, although it's not as homogeneous as it once was, Sweden is a very homogeneous country with a good sense of shared culture that goes back many years. You wonder whether the kinds of policies they did in Sweden, which did not involve lockdowns and so on, worked well there, but couldn't work very well in other situations.
Yeah, I know a lot of people complained about what Sweden did, and they thought it was going to be a lot worse than it ended up being. Very well could have been worse, like if country like the United States did it, right?
This is the beginning of thinking about this.
Well, if there are no more comments,
Yeah, thank you all online.
we are grateful for the opportunity. This is a very interesting paper and topic at the intersection of different subfields, economics, political theory, theory of organization.
As I said, it's rooted in our PPE majors, so it's even more odd for me as I don't usually do this sort of thing.
Okay, one more time. Thanks to those who joined us online.
Yes, thank you.
Years ago.
So that one really hit home. About